Hi, I'm David Mingay. I'm from Scotland and I'm here to tell you why I study psychology. This is my leg. There's an enormous scar on it which I acquired when I was 17 years old. It took 3 operations and a 3-month stay in hospital to fix it, and even then only the front bone, the tibia, has been reconnected, and the backbone is still in a pretty unpleasant condition many years later. So, how did this happen? Well, this is my 1968 BSA 450 single, which I bought in 1975. It's still going strong, and being a motorcycle, of course, at some point I fell off it and broke my leg. Here's some other attractive photographs. This is me as an 18-year-old on my Easy Rider bike, and here's the Ducati I bought from the compensation from having an accident. So you can see a good motorcyclist will never be put off even by a hideously mangled leg. So the bottom line is motorcycles are dangerous. Everybody knows that. Even the tramps in this cartoon wish that their son had got something safer than a broken motorcycle. Just how dangerous are motorcycles? Well, we can see from this graph that on the whole it's about 20 times more dangerous. You can go 20 times further in a car before having an accident than you can on a motorcycle. Because I'd had an accident and I knew that motorcycles were dangerous, but I was somehow addicted to motorcycling, I decided to find out why. Why are motorcycles more dangerous, and why do motorcyclists continue to ride them despite the fact they are dangerous? I found myself doing some research at Trinity College in Dublin in Ireland, and I was fortunate enough to be able to get access to the Norwich Union Insurance Company's data on accidents. They're the only company in Ireland which insured motorcycles, so basically the data I had was of all the motorcycle accidents in Ireland for the year that I was studying. This is back in the 1980s, and so an enormous and comprehensive data set which allowed me to find out all sorts of interesting things about motorcycle accidents. This diagram here shows the, if you like, the configuration of accidents. The little circle is a motorbike, the little square is a car, and if you look closely at this and do some calculations, you'll see that most accidents, the majority of accidents involving a motorcycle, involve a car pulling out of a side road in front of the motorcycle, pulling across the path of a motorcycle to turn right, pulling across the path of a motorcycle to turn left, whether the motorcycle is behind or coming from in front of the car. Basically, cars pulling in front of motorcycles. The suggestion from this is that there's something about motorcycles, perhaps the fact that they're very narrow compared to a car, that just makes them difficult to see. Other factors, possibly because there are far fewer motorcycles, car drivers aren't expecting to see them, and are looking for the far more common vehicles, cars, trucks, etc., etc. So when a motorcycle comes along, they just fail to spot it. Now, this sort of thing led to an advertising campaign in Britain, which I'll show you now.
If you imagine this is your car, then this is a motorcycle. Now, when you drive up to a main road, it's easy to see other cars. But because a motorcycle is a third of the width of a car, he's very hard to see. But he's dead easy to hurt. Nasty. And that's why, at junctions, I'm asking you to give a second thought for bikes. Stop, think once for cars, hold it, then think again for bikes. If you want to avoid this, think once, think twice, think bike.
What they found from this quite dramatic advertisement was that it did work. It did reduce motorcycle accidents, but only during the campaign. So if the advert was shown regularly on the television for 3 months, during that 3 months, the number of accidents involving a car pulling out in front of a motorbike decreased, but then quickly rose to original levels again after the campaign stopped. Another idea that was tried was that in order to make motorcycles more visible, they should be encouraged to use their headlights during the day. Research in a laboratory showed that motorcycles were easier to spot if they had their headlights on. Now, what was interesting about my data was that I had in the insurance files an indication of whether the motorcycle had a headlight on or not. So I thought, well, an interesting comparison would be to get out and find out how many motorcycles are using headlights in normal everyday use. And if headlights are effective in reducing accidents, what I should expect to find is that in the accident files, far fewer of them had headlights on. Now, what we can see from this slide, however, is that accident-involved motorcycles were more likely to have their headlights on. This might strike you as quite strange, but and it did to me as well, actually. But what I did was I came across a theory by a Canadian chap called Jerry Wild, called risk homeostasis theory. Now, homeostasis is similar to the mechanism you might have in a fridge, for example. If the fridge gets too cold, the cooling mechanism shuts off until the fridge heats back up to the temperature you want. If it overheats, then the cooling mechanism turns back on so that it keeps the fridge's temperature at a nice stable level. Similarly, human beings, it would appear, according to Wild's research, have a risk homeostasis mechanism. So if you make things more dangerous, people will drive more carefully to compensate for it. If you make things safer, people will drive more riskily to bring their risk to whatever target level is appropriate for them. People vary in their chosen target level of risk. Some people are risk seekers, other people prefer a calmer, safer experience on the road and will drive quite cautiously anyway. Now, further research showed that other ostensible safety mechanisms seem to have the same effect as daytime headlights on motorcycles. BMW cars, for example, were the first to fit anti-lock brakes to their cars, and what they found was that it didn't reduce the number of accidents that BMW owners were involved in. Those with anti-lock brakes fitted had different sorts of accidents. They were more likely to brake too late and go straight on through a bend, whereas those without anti-lock brakes were more likely to lock up their wheels and slide sideways off the road, but they still had the same number of accidents. Compulsory seatbelts in cars, that reduced the number of car occupants who were killed in car accidents and increased the number of pedestrians and cyclists that were killed by cars because people were driving more dangerously because they had seatbelts fitted. Another researcher who I became friendly with through this research, who was living in London at the time, lived in a street where there had been no accidents, but parents thought it was a very dangerous road because it was busy, and they managed to get the local council to install a pedestrian crossing in the street. And in the year after the installation of the pedestrian crossing, there were 2 serious injury accidents involving children. So no safety device, no accidents, introduced the safety device, an increase in the number of accidents. Other research that was done on motorcycle safety training schemes, where motorcyclists were taught by experienced riders how to ride more safely, it was found that graduates of that scheme had more accidents. Presumably they felt safer, again a psychological phenomenon overcoming an engineering one. They felt safer, they drove more riskily, they had more accidents. So in general, it looks as though accident prevention can't be brought about by purely engineering measures, fitting devices to cars or the road, so forth, to increase safety. Safety is a psychological phenomenon, and that's why I'm interested in it. If this is the case, what can we do to reduce accidents? One cynic, not me, suggested the introduction of the steering wheel spike Car drivers should be banned from wearing seatbelts because they're dangerous, and every car should be fitted with a huge spike in the middle of the steering wheel, which, if you think about it, would probably make you drive far more carefully. Other more serious suggestions are using psychological methods to get people to drive more carefully. The history of drink driving in Britain and America is quite interesting. Laws were introduced to stop people from drinking and driving, which didn't have that much of an effect. Extra policing didn't have much of an effect. What did have an effect was persuading people's children to tell off their parents for drinking and driving because they didn't want their parents to die. So essentially sort of shaming people into not drinking and driving had quite a significant effect. And what you find now in Britain, for example, is that people who continue to drink and drive are the old generation, and young people, on the whole, don't drink and drive. Now, the problem with motorcycles, as I see it, is that I think they're a special category. A researcher in Wales did some research into the average personality of car drivers versus motorcyclists, their motivations for driving and riding motorcycles, etc., and found huge differences. Motorcyclists, on the whole, categorized themselves as enthusiasts. They saw motorcycling as a way of life, etc., whereas car drivers, on the whole, see it as a mode of transport, apart from a small minority, obviously, who are devoted to their cars. So, on the whole, I'm quite pessimistic about being able to make motorcycling safer, because motorcyclists, on the whole, it appears, ride motorcycles because they're risky, not in spite of the risks involved. What could be done, a lot of people use motorcycles because they're a cheap means of transport. So my suggestion there would be to subsidise public transport and get these people off of bikes and onto buses and trains and so forth, and then recategorise the motorcyclists that are left, not as a means of transport but as a sport. And as a sport, motorcycling comes out relatively well. There are far more dangerous sports. Even swimming, it turns out, has more deaths per mile swum than motorcycling. So, on the whole, that's it. Bottom line, there are a lot of things that people out there don't believe are psychological. They are psychological. Some of them are very interesting, and that's why I study psychology.